In 1971, the world's most powerful promise broke. One signature, one televised announcement, and money was no longer tied to anything real. The gold standard ended, and a new system was born. Invisible, limitless, and irreversible. It was called monetary freedom. In reality, it was a cage without walls. The public celebrated flexibility. Economists called it progress. But behind closed doors, central banks saw something different, a chance to create control without confrontation. From that year onward, money was no longer mined, it was printed. And whoever could print could rule. Debt became the new gold. But unlike gold, it had no limit. Every dollar issued required someone, somewhere to owe. The global economy transformed into a machine that ran on promises, expanding, consuming, inflating. The more it grew, the more it needed to grow. By the 1980s, credit cards appeared in every wallet. Nations borrowed like households. Growth became survival. If the flow stopped, the system collapsed. What once was a tool for exchange became an instrument of dependence. And here lies the paradox. The freer the market became, the less freedom individuals had within it. Your income, your mortgage, your pension, all chained to the same expanding cycle of debt. Each economic boom was paid with future years of your labor. This wasn't a conspiracy, it was design. A system built not to destroy, but to sustain itself indefinitely. Through you. Every paycheck, every loan, every swipe reinforced the loop. The illusion was comfort, the substance, control. And now imagine a world where every number on every screen is debt, not wealth. That world isn't coming, it's already here. To understand how this mechanism was born, we have to go back nearly 30 years earlier, to 1944. A small mountain resort in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Behind the closed doors of the Mount Washington Hotel, 730 delegates from 44 nations gathered to redesign the global order. On the tables, maps, balance sheets, cigarettes. Outside, a world exhausted by war. The Second World War had left entire economies in ruins. Europe was shattered, Asia burned, and global trade had come to a halt. Most currencies were unstable. Faith in paper money had collapsed. The world needed a new anchor, and the United States offered one. Their currency, the dollar, would become the center of the system, but not just any dollar, a dollar backed by gold. The logic was simple and brilliant. Each nation would fix its currency to the dollar, and the dollar itself would be fixed to gold at $35 an ounce. Stability through hierarchy, trust through metal. For the first time, money was to be managed globally, not by markets, but by a coordinated agreement between states. On paper, it looked like cooperation. In reality, it was dependence, because the only country with enough gold to guarantee the system was the United States. By 1945, America held nearly 2/3 of the world's official gold reserves. It could print, lend, and rebuild, while others borrowed and rebuilt with borrowed dollars. That is how the post-war miracle began. The Marshall Plan poured billions into Europe, new roads, new industries, new governments, all financed through the same channel. Money flowed outward, and faith flowed back in. The dollar wasn't just a currency anymore, it was a political instrument. The more the world used it, the stronger the system became. But a quiet imbalance was already forming. Gold was finite, dollars were not. And every loan, every reconstruction project, every trade surplus built an invisible tension. There were now more dollars circulating abroad than gold to redeem them. It was a paradox wrapped in success. The stronger the American-led system became, the weaker its foundation grew. Because trust, unlike gold, can vanish overnight. And when it finally did, the world would discover that the promise of stability was, in fact, a calculated dependency. By the late 1950s, the numbers no longer matched the narrative. On one side, the world spoke of American strength. On the other, the balance sheets told another story. Between 1958 and 1965, the amount of US dollars held abroad doubled, yet the gold reserves in Fort Knox barely moved. Foreign governments began to notice. France, under Charles de Gaulle, was the first to say it out loud. "We want gold," his finance minister announced in 1965, because gold has no nationality. Ships quietly left New York Harbor, carrying bars back to Europe. What followed wasn't panic, it was arithmetic. For every $35 promised, there was only enough gold for perhaps half. The entire system, Bretton Woods, post-war order, dollar supremacy, depended on one fragile belief, that no one would ask for the gold all at once. It was a confidence trick, scaled to the size of civilization. As long as trust held, the machine worked. When trust cracked, the gears began to grind. The cracks deepened with Vietnam. The U.S. was spending billions a month overseas, financing war not with taxes, but with printing presses. Dollars flowed out, debt piled up, inflation crept in. By 1970, foreign central banks held $40 billion in U.S. claims, while America's gold stock had fallen below $11 billion. The ratio was terminal. Some historians call it the gold drain. Others, more bluntly, call it exposure. The United States was promising convertibility it could no longer deliver, and yet it couldn't stop printing either, because global trade itself now required an expanding supply of dollars. The trap had closed on everyone. Markets sensed it. Speculators bet against the dollar. European banks refused to hold it. Panic moved quietly through cables and vaults. Then came August 15, 1971. In a brief television address, President Richard Nixon announced what he called a temporary suspension of dollar-gold convertibility. It was supposed to last a few months. It has lasted ever since. The Bretton Woods system collapsed overnight, and with it, the last tangible link between money and material reality. The world's currencies began to float, unanchored, untethered, and profoundly dependent on one another's promises. For the first time in modern history, money was based purely on faith. Governments could now create it with keystrokes, not minds. Banks could multiply it through credit, not savings. Debt became infinite, and therefore indispensable. And so the problem revealed itself. The system could not survive without growth, and yet growth itself depended on the very debt it produced. A perfect loop, self-sustaining, but never self-liberating. If this part of the story shifted how you see the word money, tell me where you're watching from. After 1971, the machine was rebuilt, not dismantled. The rules changed, but the operators remained the same. What had been a gold-backed structure transformed into a credit-backed one, and the new material of stability became debt itself. Here's how it worked. Without gold as a constraint, central banks could issue currency without a physical limit. Commercial banks could then multiply that currency through lending. Each loan created new money, a digital entry backed by a promise to repay. Money began to expand not through production, but through obligation. It was elegant, almost invisible. Every time a person borrowed to buy a home, a car, or a business, the total money supply increased. When governments borrowed to fund budgets or wars, the same thing happened on a grander scale. Debt was no longer a sign of weakness. It was the lifeblood of the new economy. In technical terms, this was called fiat money. In practical terms, belief money. Its value depended entirely on trust in the issuer. As long as the public accepted that a dollar had worth, the system could create as many as needed. Inflation, interest, and policy became the new tools of control. The mechanism expanded in layers. The first layer, central banks controlling short-term interest rates. The second, commercial banks creating money through fractional reserves, lending many times more than they held. The third, markets packaging and reselling that debt as assets, bonds, securities, derivatives. Each step distanced money further from reality. The financial world became a hall of mirrors, value reflecting value, leverage feeding leverage. A small movement at the top could multiply through the system within days. It was no longer about gold in vaults, but confidence in digits. By the 1980s, credit had become a global language. Developing nations borrowed in dollars to modernize. Corporations borrowed to expand. Consumers borrowed to live. Growth appeared unstoppable, but it was circular. Every expansion of credit demanded more credit to sustain it. And then came the central paradox. The only way to stabilize the system was to keep it unstable enough to grow. Central banks intervened not to prevent crises, but to manage them. Each rescue, in 1987, 1998, 2008, created more liquidity, more dependence, more complexity. Some economists compared it to a pyramid. Others called it an ecosystem. Both were right. It was a structure that required constant input to avoid collapse. Energy in the form of debt flowing upward. The system didn't need gold anymore. It had found something far more flexible. Human belief, institutional trust, and infinite accounting. And that's why it still stands. Because the moment it stops expanding, it implodes. By the 1990s, the system had matured. Money creation was no longer a secret. It was policy. Every crisis met the same response. Lower rates, more credit, more liquidity. Each rescue made the structure taller, but also thinner. Stability was purchased with future risk. The first cracks appeared where the system was weakest, in the places most dependent on cheap money. Latin America in the 1980s. Asia in 1997. Then, the United States itself in 2008. Each time the same pattern unfolded. Borrowing fueled growth, confidence inflated prices, and when the debt cycle reversed, everything fell. The debt that once rebuilt nations now began to consume them. Governments couldn't stop borrowing because their economies depended on spending. Households couldn't stop borrowing because wages stopped growing. Every level of society leaned on the same invisible pillar, credit expansion. And when that pillar trembled, the illusion of prosperity cracked. In 2008, more than 50 million people lost their jobs worldwide. Entire housing markets evaporated. Trillions vanished, not in factories or fields, but on screens. Money disappeared because belief disappeared. To save the system, central banks did what seemed unthinkable. They created trillions out of nothing. It was called quantitative easing. In practice, it meant buying debt with more debt. The numbers were vast: 4 trillion from the Federal Reserve, 3 trillion from the European Central Bank, and counting. The logic was circular but effective. If trust was gone, they would manufacture it. But every solution bred its next problem. By removing risk, central banks removed discipline. Markets stopped fearing loss. Corporations borrowed to buy back their own shares. Governments postponed reform. The economy became a perpetual motion machine, spinning faster to stay upright. Inequality widened. Capital accumulated where credit was cheapest, in financial centers, among those closest to the source of new money. For the rest, debt became survival. Education, housing, healthcare, all priced in leverage. The system didn't collapse. It absorbed the shock and passed the cost downward. By the 2010s, the architecture of dependence was complete. Central banks had become the ultimate market makers. The line between the public and the private blurred. Risk was socialized, profits privatized. Money was no longer a reflection of value. It was a reflection of power. And yet, for most, life seemed normal. The illusion held because the system still functioned. But beneath it, the imbalance grew between those who could create money and those who could only owe it. Some call it stability, others, quiet confiscation. Today, the machine runs almost entirely on screens. Money no longer needs to exist in paper form and rarely does. It lives as code, lines in a database, created or erased by decision. Yet the principle hasn't changed. The promise still expands faster than reality. They call it modern monetary policy, or more recently, quantitative easing, stimulus, liquidity support. But in essence, it's the same mechanism that began in 1971. Money created from nothing, sustained by trust alone. Then it was called inflation. Today, it's called growth. Governments print to fund deficits. Corporations borrow to inflate valuations. Consumers use credit to survive stagnating wages. Every actor depends on the same artificial pulse. The global economy has become a single organism, breathing debt in, exhaling consumption out. And now imagine, every dollar in circulation, every digital unit in your bank account is someone else's liability. If all debts were repaid tomorrow, there would be almost no money left. The system cannot clear itself. It can only roll forward. The new twist came quietly, disguised as innovation. Digital finance, algorithmic trading, cryptocurrencies, and now, central bank digital currencies. Technology made the structure faster, more efficient, and more opaque. The logic, however, remained ancient. Whoever controls issuance controls dependency. During the pandemic, trillions appeared overnight. Entire economies were kept alive by central bank keystrokes. The line between emergency and normality disappeared. What was once called extraordinary policy is now routine management. And in this new normal, the loop tightened. Every stimulus required a new justification. Every rate cut demanded another. When inflation returned in 2021, it wasn't a surprise. It was the system revealing its cost. The cure for crisis had become its cause. Some economists say we've entered the era of financial feudalism. A few institutions create credit, the rest compete for access to it. Wealth flows upward, debt flows downward. For those at the top, money generates itself. For everyone else, it comes with an interest rate attached. And yet, the illusion persists that technology will liberate us, that digital currencies will democratize finance. But digitalization doesn't remove control, it concentrates it. When every transaction is traceable, every asset programmable, freedom becomes conditional. In 1944, they anchored money to gold. In 1971, to government promise. Today, it's anchored to data, the last resource still unpriced, still harvestable. The system no longer needs gold mines, it mines behavior. Some historians might say the loop is complete, from physical to political, from political to digital. The mechanism hasn't evolved, it has perfected itself. And now imagine a system where money expires, interest is automated, and spending patterns define your access. It sounds futuristic, but central banks are already testing it. History didn't change, only the interface did. If this helped you see the present through the logic of the past, tell me where you're watching from. The system they built was never meant to end. It was meant to evolve, silently, invisibly, endlessly. What began as a solution to a post-war crisis became a permanent architecture of control, not through violence, but through dependence. Today, no one needs to enforce it. It sustains itself. You work, you spend, you borrow, and the cycle continues. The mechanism runs beneath every transaction, every paycheck, every click. It doesn't demand belief, it just requires participation. That's the brilliance of it. A system that hides behind normality. It doesn't forbid freedom, it prices it. It doesn't confiscate, it offers credit. And in doing so, it transforms consent into fuel. Some think it can't last. Others believe it doesn't need to. Because systems like this don't collapse, they adapt. They change language, symbols, interfaces. Gold became paper. Paper became code. And code will become policy. Perhaps that's the real secret. There is no trap without our reflection in it. The loop closes only when we stop asking how it works. History doesn't repeat, it updates.